September 2010, Greg Fleniken, 55 years old. A petroleum businessman in the state of Louisiana walked into the Elegante Hotel in Texas. He entered room 348 and never walked out of it again. The next morning, Greg did not call his wife, Mrs. Susie, nor did he go to the office. So two colleagues went to the hotel and asked the hotel manager to open the door. As soon as they entered, they were shocked to discover the body of Greg lying on the floor. The TV was still on, candy and cigarettes scattered all over the floor. $1,000 in cash was still intact in the room. There were no signs of forced entry, nor were there any traces of a fight having occurred. Greg was a heavy smoker, to the point that a cigarette was still clamped between two fingers when he passed away. Initially, people thought he had passed away due to natural causes, like a heart attack. However, until the autopsy, they saw something horrifying. His ribs were broken, his liver, stomach, and scrotum were also torn. His heart had a hole in it. His groin and hip area were bruised. His organs were also severely damaged. Greg had been murdered by being beaten or crushed to death. But there was one detail, extremely important, and it was also very strange. That all the serious injuries to Greg's internal organs did not cause any significant damage to the outer body at all. There was almost no bruising on his body, except for the groin area that showed the injuries. All occurred inside the body. There were only a few possibilities to explain this. One is that Greg was beaten elsewhere and then returned to the room before passing away. But with the level of injury the body had to endure, he would have had internal hemorrhaging and died within just 30 seconds. So it was almost impossible that Greg had enough time to return to the room. That led to the conclusion that he was assaulted right in his room. But in the room, there was no evidence at all. No signs of disturbance, and the people in the adjacent rooms also said they didn't hear anything unusual. Sounds very unreasonable, right? The only unusual detail investigators found was that early that evening, Greg made popcorn in the microwave, causing the circuit breaker to trip. The electrical system in his room had to be fixed that night, and so a maintenance worker was sent up. From there, a hypothesis emerged. This maintenance worker was a sex offender with a criminal record. The police suspected it was very likely that the injuries to the scrotum and the internal organ injuries of Greg were caused by a bizarre and horrifying attack. However, this hypothesis was quickly ruled out because the maintenance worker had a solid alibi. The next hypothesis involved the men in the room next to Greg's room. It was a group of electricians who often gathered in the room at night to drink. Perhaps when Greg caused the power outage for the whole row, they got angry, a scuffle occurred, and they beat him in the hallway. Then Greg tried to crawl back to his room and passed away there. However, this hypothesis was also not convincing because those men said they did not see Greg, and furthermore, his injuries were not entirely consistent with a normal beating. Moreover, was still clamped in his hand in a very calm manner, not like the action of someone who had just been assaulted. This became one of the most difficult cases that investigators had ever encountered, and it reached a stalemate for months. Finally, Greg's family offered a $50,000 reward for anyone who could provide information, but no one came forward until the legendary private investigator, former Long Island police officer and agent, and Brandon took on Greg's case. Brandon started interviewing everyone, including Greg's wife and the forensic doctor. There was one clue that no one else noticed. That was the cigarette discovered in Greg's left hand, while his wife always insisted that he always smoked with his right hand. Brandon thought that Greg must have stood up and switched the cigarette to his other hand to potentially open the door for someone to enter the room. This detail led him back to the group of electricians in the next room. It was very likely Greg stood up to open the door when they came to knock after the power outage. Some of his injuries, such as the tear in the scrotum, could have been from a kick from a pointed toe shoe, the type that electricians often wear. When Brandon reinterrogated the group of electricians, a detail was revealed. One person in the group mentioned that he heard the sound of A gunshot in the hotel. Immediately, Brandon formed a new hypothesis. After many hours of searching, nothing was discovered. Until Brandon noticed a small dent on the wall that had been repaired. When checking the adjacent room, he also discovered a small trace hole, showing the bullet had penetrated the wall. The exit hole of the bullet was the dent in Greg's room. And the truth was that Greg had been shot. The forensic doctors initially did not accept this hypothesis because there was no gunshot wound on Greg's body, and they believed it was impossible for them to have missed such a detail. But then they collectively examined the autopsy photos very carefully. Brandon asked the question, could it be that the bullet entered Greg's body through the scrotum where there were tears and bruising? The forensic doctor agreed that this was entirely possible if the bullet entered at a suitable angle and the skin folds had hidden the entry path. The bullet then tore through the internal organs inside, explaining why these injuries looked like the consequences of a brutal beating. The hole in Greg's heart was what convinced the forensic doctors. Previously, this wound was thought to be due to the right atrium rupturing from blunt force trauma, but after re-examining, the doctors realized it was actually a hole from a gunshot. Finally, Greg was indeed shot. On the night that Greg passed away, a few electricians were drinking in the next room. One of them was Lance Mulla, who was playing with a gun and accidentally caused the gun to discharge. The bullet went through the wall and flew into Greg's room, hitting him while he was holding a cigarette in his hand. Greg collapsed on the spot and left almost no traces indicating what had happened. At that time, the group of electricians were also not sure if there was anyone in the next room. So when they said they didn't see Greg, they were not lying. Mulla later used toothpaste to cover up the bullet hole in his room. And when Greg's death was concluded to be from natural causes, Mulla thought it was all just a terrible coincidence. Afterward, Mulla was arrested and prosecuted for manslaughter causing death to Greg Fleniken. In court, he pleaded no contest to the charges of manslaughter due to recklessness and manslaughter due to gross negligence. He was convicted and sentenced to 15 years in prison. The winding details, full of mystery in the case of Greg, are perhaps one of the most strange cases I have ever heard.